Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sam Byers. I'm a member of the policy team here with the Vandenberg Coalition. For those of you who don't know us, the Vandenberg Coalition is a public policy organization here in Washington, D.C., dedicated to educating elected officials, policymakers, and the public about the importance of American leadership in the world, and the role a strong and proud U.S. foreign policy plays in ensuring the security and prosperity of the American people. I'm excited to be joined today by David McCormick to discuss his new book, Superpower in Peril, A Battle Plan to Renew America. David has had a long and successful career, both in government service and the private sector. He graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and served as a U.S. Army officer in the First Gulf War. After leaving the Army, he earned a PhD from Princeton School of Public Policy and International Affairs before serving as the president of two publicly traded companies and returning to government to serve in multiple senior posts in the George W. Bush administration, including as Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs. He left his most recent position as president and CEO of the investment management firm Bridgewater Associates to run for the 2022 Republican nomination for Senate in his home state of Pennsylvania. David, welcome.
Hey, Sam, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's great to have you here. So for starters, for those who haven't had the chance to read the book yet, what made you want to write Superpower in Peril? Where did you draw your inspiration, and how did your wide diversity of professional experience shape the outlook that you put forth in this book?
Yeah, well, again, thanks for having me. I started writing the book long before I decided to run for the Senate. So it was even before Pat Toomey had said he wasn't going to run for his seat in Pennsylvania. And the motivation was the belief that America was in decline in economic terms and in relative military terms and spiritual terms, and also hearing sort of the cacophony of decline, and really believing decline's not inevitable, but neither is renewal. And so this is a renewal book. It's a book about the policies and the leadership that's required to renew the country. And it really boils down to educating our people and confronting China and securing the country. And so it's a policy book that lays that out. And then I ran for the Senate for the very same reasons, believing that that we needed leadership that was going to push that kind of agenda forward.
And that's one of the things I really enjoyed reading the book, is it is a very optimistic book and about renewal. And as you say, we've kind of been there before and we've pulled ourselves out of the hole, and we can do it again. One of the things I felt was interesting, coming at the book from a foreign policy perspective, is you focus a lot on domestic strengthening, especially in the areas of talent, technology, and data. So I'm curious why those three areas, and is there one you think is kind of make or break for us, or do they all feed into each other? Do we need to really hit all three of these, or can we hit a home run on one and get by on that?
Well, first, a word on the optimism, if I might. It's got a very ominous cover and title, Superpower in Peril, which I really believe we are. I believe we're at an inflection point. But the reason it's optimistic is because this is the American story. We get to the edge of the cliff and we pull ourselves back. And that's happened throughout America's history. It happened in my lifetime, and I talk about that. But the late 70s, we were in stagflation. We had 15% inflation. The economy was in recession. We had, Desert One, where we lost 8 service members trying to rescue the Iranian hostages under President Carter. We had gas lines around the block. I remember sitting with my dad in 1979 in our station wagon, a big Ford Country Squire, on odd days and even days to get gas. And 80% of Americans felt like the country was headed in the wrong direction, which is exactly what's happening today. 80% of Americans think the country's headed in the wrong direction. And then 4 years later, I was a plebe at West Point, walking down those beautiful pathways, looking down on that gorgeous Hudson Valley, and America was back. The economy was growing, inflation was in check. We were in the middle of a military buildup that would end the Cold War without a shot 6 years later. And it was morning in America. And that was because leadership and good policies under President Reagan took us in a very different direction. And so I'm really optimistic that with the right policies and the right leadership, and half the book is on policies and half is on leadership, we can renew our country. And we've done it before, we can do it again. In terms of the policy prescriptions, I don't think, when you're a CEO, you learn that there's a lot of stuff you need to fix. There's always a lot to fix, but the key is zeroing in on the things that really you must fix. And if you can fix those things, that begins to change the direction. That gives you the latitude to fix all the other things. And I started the book with the premise that we were failing within and failing in our engagement with the world. And the failing within is the things I talked about. $31 trillion of debt. We have sky high inflation, and the key thing was that the American dream is no longer available. 75% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. About that same number think that their kids are going to be less well off than they are. And so that American dream, that dynamism in our economy has faded. And so the ability to have a dynamic economy that's highly productive, that's innovative, is really critical to the American dream. It's critical to the dynamic economy we have and to our economic strength. And that economic strength and military strength is so critical to projecting our power abroad. So that agenda is really two sides of the same coin. The strength at home, which allows America's vibrancy, allows the promise of the American dream to be available, is also a building block of the national power we need. So that was one observation. The second observation is, I referred to my time in government. And my time in government, you could see then that technological leadership, economic vitality, and national security, they were all close cousins. I was the Undersecretary of Commerce for Export Administration. I was in the National Security Council and then at the Treasury. They were all close cousins and very related to one another. But what's happened since I left government 20 years ago is the confluence of those things. You can't talk about artificial intelligence, which is sort of at the forefront of technology, without thinking about the huge economic implications for our economy and national power within the military sense. So these things are all together in a way that's, I think, unique in our history. And so an agenda that builds on our capacity to innovate, which is what the talent, the technology, and the data is all about, was sort of critical to America's role in the world. That was the logic. Excellent.
So, with the domestic and the international spheres kind of becoming more conjoined, like you said, what do you think foreign policymakers, and I know we have a lot of past and future and present policymakers and some Capitol Hill staff on the call, how should foreign policymakers who aren't used to thinking about kind of this domestic angle, how should they be approaching these policy questions with regard to technology, economics, artificial intelligence, like you mentioned?
Well, I think that from a technological perspective, I think we're in a new era that is, incredibly exciting, but also really, really frightening. And these technologies, quantum science, artificial intelligence, 5G, they have dynamics that may be a little bit different than in the past. They're in many ways zero sum. So if you have dominance in 5G, it's zero sum. It makes it very hard for the global supply chain to offer alternatives, and that standard becomes a standard around the world. That's why the battle against Huawei had such strategic significance. So these leadership in these technologies has profound implications for geopolitical power and influence. That's point one. Point two is China, which is our primary adversary, has a plan for a techno-authoritarian model that's dominant in those technologies. And they are executing their plan, and they are winning the game. So, 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a Wall Street Journal article, which many of you may have seen, which cited an Australian think tank that had done a study of 44 technologies that are really critical, this realm of criticality to both economics and national security: satellites, quantum science, robotics, AI, and so forth. This Australian think tank said that China was in the lead in 37 of those 44, right? That has profound implications. So then what do you say? Well, what do you want to do when you're being confronted with an adversary that has a model that appears to be, at least at the time, succeeding, and where you're failing, well, you look internally first. What's happening as a byproduct of our own weakness, and so you go to the gym. You go to the gym and you build muscle, and that's the muscle you need to be able to compete and protect and advance American interest abroad. And so think of those three areas of education, technology, leadership, and data. Think about that as going to the gym. You don't want to ever get into a fight. Let's hope we don't get into a fight, but you never want to get into a fight without being strong. And you gotta build that muscle at home, and hopefully building that muscle allows you to be able to deter aggression abroad and not have to get in a fight.
Absolutely. And I'll add for the audience, we do have some time reserved at the end for audience Q&A. So think of your questions, add them to the Q&A box. They'll pop up on the screen here, and we can get a few towards the end. You mentioned, China is our main adversary, and it's a theme that is kind of laced throughout the book and then addressed explicitly towards the end in one or two chapters, and your strategy kind of for competing with China. I'm curious how you see the interconnection between China and America's other adversaries. Recently, we saw Xi Jinping reaffirm his support for Vladimir Putin on a trip to Moscow. Beijing is similarly extending its influence, just in the news with a recent deal, rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. These rivals are all connected in some way. China's perhaps the leader. How do you see these connections? How should America compete and try to lead in these other theaters, in your view?
Well, as I cite in the book, I've been going to China, since early 1990. I think 1992 was the first time I went to China. I talk in the book about riding the Iron Rooster. I read Paul Thoreau's book about riding the Iron Rooster, and rode across these dilapidated trains through China. And China of then was, really a rural community. When you go to Beijing or Shanghai, there's a few skyscrapers. And then I went back as the Undersecretary of Commerce, and down a 10-lane highway into Beijing, which was a sky full of cranes. And so China's advancement in the world, its technological prowess, what it's accomplished, it should not be underestimated. And there's lots of failures of U.S. policy along the way that has put us in a vulnerable position, in my opinion. But China's not to be underestimated. Now, there are those who say it shouldn't be overestimated either. And I agree that there's some fundamental flaws that ultimately will create big challenges for China into the future. But what it's done in terms of challenging American supremacy is profound. And as I say throughout the book, China has a plan. China has a plan for technological leadership. China has a plan for building a very potent military force and is well on the way. China has a plan for exporting its ideology around the world. And China has a plan for checking and ultimately overcoming America as the global superpower. And the two examples you cite, if you ever needed better evidence, it's in 1 week to see the foreign minister of China brokering a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and simultaneously President Xi in Russia offering his support for Putin. That isn't accidental. That is part of an orchestrated strategy to replace America's leadership in the world. And so what can we do? Well, first of all, we have to, not to repeat myself, but strengthen ourselves at home. And we need to demonstrate strong leadership abroad. And I believe China's posture and its aggressive behavior and aggressive behavior of others like Putin is the byproduct of weak leadership. I think when American leadership seems uncertain, when it seems ham-handed, it invites others, in this case, President Xi and Putin, to challenge us. And I think you cannot underestimate the impact of the Afghanistan withdrawal, both the abrupt nature of it, but also the incompetence of it. It didn't seem worthy of America. And that was honestly one of the reasons I ran for the Senate. And I don't think you can underestimate the role that the Biden administration played in encouraging, in some ways, the advance into Ukraine, because of the way that it handled the pipeline and Nord Stream 2 and all of that. And I think sent mixed signals to Putin. And I think the satellite balloon is the same example, where the responses seem ham-handed. America's leadership seems uncertain. And when that happens, you're challenged. And so That's one point, is strong leadership that's backed up with real capability and a certainty and confidence in terms of how we act. The second thing I'd say, and I've talked to some of our friends abroad, they're not confident America's got their back. And that's certainly what's happening in the Middle East among long-term allies like the Emirates and Saudi Arabia and others, where they have has traditionally based their geopolitical engagement in the world on confidence in America's support for them, for their interest, for our common interest. And I think that that support and the consistency of that suspect. And as a result of that, they're looking for other allies. And China's there to take advantage of that moment of weakness.
You know, and when it comes to working, you know, with other partners, there's working with allies and partners on the state-to-state level, but also, you know, the government to business and the government to private sector level. I'm curious, you know, what you think government, those of us down here in Washington, need to learn about working with the business community, and especially, you know, publicly traded companies that are beholden to their shareholders. How do we get the business side of the American economy on board with competition with China and kind of building those partnerships? Because the competition we're looking at now, it's much more economically inflected. It's much more intertwined than our Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union ever was, which is really our only other example in American history of this sort of competition.
Well, I think the government needs to fill a bit of a void here as it relates to China. I think you know, it's not realistic given the size of China's market and given the investments and tradition of what's happened in the previous decades, to expect that companies are going to guess what the expectations are. I mean, they'll make judgments based on the political risk and so forth. But I think the government needs to come forward with a whole of nation strategy for how we should deal with China. And, you know, one of the contradictions throughout the book, as a conservative, I'm arguing for small government and the government playing a limited role in sort of unlocking the potential of the American work of the American entrepreneur. But there's several instances where I'm arguing for a very specific government role in big tech, in technology policy, and in China in particular. And I think what we need to have is in addition to going to the gym, which I described, we need to strategically decouple from China, and we need to get on with that. And I lay out a framework for how to think about that. But you know, it's certainly a failure of policy that could be attributed to both Republicans and Democrats, that our pharmaceutical supply chains are dependent on China, that the semiconductor industry is offshore. And 90% of the semiconductors we need are manufactured 90 miles from mainland China. That's a failure of policy. So picking those industries which need to either be back in the United States or within the hands, the supply chains in the hands of our closest allies is a critical thing. The second thing I argue for is a really strong leadership on issues to hold China accountable for, and human rights with the Uyghurs is one. But COVID is a second. It's almost hard to imagine that we suffered as a world and as in a country from COVID, and we still don't know the origins of COVID. And there's been obfuscation on the part of the Chinese. The idea that the Wuhan labs could somehow be related to the creation of a virus in Wuhan. The fact that we can't even have that conversation until very recently with the idea that the intelligence services have thought of similar things. So we need to stand strong on that thing and not let China's obfuscation or its bad behavior stand unchallenged, even if it's only in a rhetorical sense. The third thing we need to do is give specific guidelines around investing in China. And what I describe here is sort of a reverse CFIUS, where we have a review of certain types of investments going to China. It seems unthinkable to me, but it's happening, that today in the Silicon Valley, there are companies investing in artificial intelligence firms in China that work with the PLA and the Communist Party. That seems like a direct affront to American interest, and we need to give specific guidelines. And then finally, we need a clear, unequivocal strategy of engagement with our allies in the region to ensure that we're advancing U.S. interests and advancing their interest in pursuit of checking aggressive behavior on the part of the Chinese. And so that's the kind of framework and the kind of policies that I think we need to give the business community clear guidance on where we're headed. And in the absence of clear direction and guidance, different businesses will make a variety of decisions. Some will de-risk, some will think that it's overstated. We shouldn't allow them to guess. The stakes are too high.
Do you think, you mentioned Silicon Valley companies still investing in AI in China and other examples. Do you think there are certain sectors of the economy or certain areas in business that have, for lack of a better term, gotten it and are on the right page with China? Or does the government still need to do a lot of educating? Do organizations like Vandenberg, do we need to push to educate the business world about the danger and the risk?
Well, I think there's certainly, I think there's an awakening happening, but people are in different stages of awakening. And so I think more of the education and the risk, I mean, in the past, people have judged their risk solely in terms of intellectual property rights and things like that. I think what's happening now is we need to have an assessment of a whole of nation assessment of the risk. But I'm going beyond educating. I'm saying we should be specific in terms of restrictions, regulations, legislation that require certain actions on the part of the business community. And let me give it a brief aside here. One of the things that I have found profoundly disappointing, the more I thought about this, the more I wrote in the book, at the core of American power historically has been the partnership between the business community and government. And if you went back to the Cold War and some of the greatest advances, the cooperation between the Pentagon and industry was terrific. That's not been the case with big tech. Project Maven's a good example where we haven't had, because software developers and the workers have been reluctant to be involved with the government. That to me is an unacceptable. That's an unacceptable answer. Listen, the privilege that comes with being able to be a business based in America, have all the privilege that comes with being American, being an American company, free enterprise, all the freedom that comes with that, that also comes with it a set of responsibilities. And I think big tech in particular, though you can point to others, but big tech in particular has failed, in my opinion, on that responsibility. And I think that that's one of the areas the government should play a bit more of an intrusive role. I tried to describe what that role would be in a way that's consistent with principles and avoiding government overreach and politicization. But make no mistake, that lack of collaboration with our government, our national interest is disappointing. We need to be specific on China.
Excellent. Turning more towards the political thread that runs through the book, you write in the introduction about, and you explore kind of throughout the book, the tensions at the heart of the conservative movement that have come about since the election of Donald Trump back in 2016. And I think that tension is very clearly manifest in the foreign policy community, and we've had a protracted debate about America's role in the world and the scale of U.S. involvement that's still going on in large part. I'm curious, where do you think that the eventual synthesis of the different threads might lead? What do you think the future of conservative foreign policy is going to look like, or Republican foreign policy is going to look like? And does that match up with the vision that you would like that foreign policy to be?
Well, I think we're in the middle of of an evolution of debate, which is probably mostly healthy, mostly healthy. And I try to just cut to the chase in the book when I talk about what I experience and what I think analytically is true, which is, I think the Republican Party, and this is particularly as it relates to domestic policy, has been sleepwalking a bit. And, the notion of lower taxes, small government will ultimately lead to economic growth and prosperity was too simplistic. It didn't. Globalization, engagement with China, those things didn't play out quite the way we had hoped. And this is a really important takeaway. I sort of instinctually knew this, but the running in Pennsylvania really reinforced it, which is listen, the last 20 years have been great for a certain subset of our population, but they've not been great for a big part of our population. So if you held assets, I was in the Treasury in 2008. If you've held assets between 2008 and today, 15 years, you pretty much made a lot of money. Like, you're richer. You didn't have to be that smart. You just had to hold assets, right? So anybody that tells you that they're a genius, everybody that had assets got richer. It was just how much richer. But that was only like, 10 or 15% of the population. Most people don't have assets. Most people are living paycheck to paycheck, and real income stayed flat. Then you look at what's happened with globalization. Well, globalization has brought great benefits to our country and to the economy, but it's been disproportional in its cost and disruptive and expensive to lots of small communities, many of which near where I grew up in, outside of Scranton in Pennsylvania. 2 decades of war. Those 2 decades of war have had disproportionate cost on a certain subset. The socioeconomic, the lowest 2 quartiles are where the majority of our young men and women are drawn from. The fentanyl crisis, which is a big deal from open borders, is really hurting lots of communities. It's particularly hurting blue collar communities and minority communities. So there's a big chunk of the population that's unsatisfied with a policy agenda that conservatives, and really Democrats and Republicans, but particularly conservatives, have put forth. And that is what created the opportunity, I think, where President Trump ran in 2016. So I try to talk about that. And I think to dismiss those concerns of those voters and not come forth with a conservative vision for how to address that would be a mistake. And so that's what the book is trying to do, is trying to acknowledge those things and put forward an agenda that would address at least some of those things in a way that brings more widespread prosperity, more opportunity for all. The education agenda. Education today is particularly discriminatory for minorities and blue collar families in terms of giving them the best opportunity, because people that can afford other options do. So that's what the agenda is meant to be. Now, there's another aspect of the debate, which I assume you're referring to, which is how America should engage in the world. And I don't talk about that in a huge way in the book, only to say that I think we could all agree that however ambitious our engagement is in the world, we should do so with strength, and that strength at home and dynamism at home is the basis of our strength and power projection abroad. And so things like Ukraine and America's role in supporting Ukraine, I don't get into. I've spoken publicly about that, which is to say, I believe that we should play an active role in supporting the Ukrainians, a very active role to help them achieve success. But I believe we should do that because it's in America's interest. And I believe to not do so would invite chaos in Europe and also invite China to play a more aggressive role on the global stage. But we need to do that with a recognition of the genuine concerns of those who want to ensure that U.S. troops don't get drawn into an engagement there, which will, be another long war where we don't suffer from some of the corruption, where U.S. treasure is being spent in ways and inconsistent with U.S. objectives. So there's learnings that we can have from the past, and the objections of those who are worried about Ukraine. I think we need to address those objections with confidence and also seriously, because there's merit to some of those concerns, even if you're one like I who believes that America needs to play an active role.
Excellent. I'm going to turn over and add a few audience questions into the mix. So everyone who has thoughts on their mind, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get through as many as we can in the time we have remaining. To start, we have John Mark Wilson asked, some of the most innovative technology companies require access to the best talent across the world. What do we need to do to compete with China for attracting the world's best technologists to work in our companies? And I know this is something that you get into in the book. So I'm curious to.
Well, thanks for that question. I really try to hit that question head on in a couple of different ways. I mean, part of the reason that we're dependent on technologists from outside the United States is that our education system here is suffering. As I think I mentioned earlier, we're like 22nd in the world among industrialized countries for math, science, and engineering. Part of that is creating the right level of competition and dynamism in our schools to create the next generation of great technologists. Part of it's the skilled workers. We have a philosophy, a conceptual notion in the United States is the only path to success. The only path to a great, a living is a traditional college. But I think we're finding more and more that there's huge opportunity for skilled training for our workforce. And part of the challenge with the semiconductor industry is many of you on this call may know, is that we just can't get skilled workers. So there's a huge opportunity to make a national priority of skilled workers training, whether it's in fracking, like my home state of Pennsylvania, whether it's in software development, and a whole continuum of technological workers can be provided from those sorts of programs. And then finally, I make a strong case for skilled immigration. I start with a real acknowledgement that the illegal immigration problem is a genuine problem. I visited the border during my campaign. I saw that up close and personal. I think those who minimize that do so at their peril of not understanding the significance of that for everything from drug cartels to economic cost. But beyond that, we need to pair really fixing the border problem with genuine legal immigration reform. And so I lay out what I think the skilled immigration reform should be. And in a nutshell, it's much more an orientation towards merit and skills where we have the biggest needs in our economy, and a system somewhat analogous to what Canada has. And so those would be the three things that require emphasis. And the reason I talk about that is one of the pillars is because, you asked the question, is one more important than the others? I don't think one's more important than the others, but I don't think we can lead in the world over the next few decades unless we fix this education problem in our country. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition for renewal, but it's one that's going to require profound change.
Excellent. Another question we have from Michael Meese is, how can the government support building muscle, in the economy with technology without just devolving into crony capitalism and picking those with the best lobbyists rather than those, with the best company or the best technology or the best ideas? How do we kind of avoid that pitfall?
Michael, you got to read this book, buddy. You're gonna like it. I try to hit that head on because what I'm here. Let me start by saying what I'm not advocating. What I'm not advocating is a China model. China has had great success with thus far with its combination of state-owned enterprises investing in key technologies, thievery. A big part of the China success has been theft. But we can't replicate China. We shouldn't try. I'm also not arguing for traditional industrial policy. I think the CHIPS Act was a good example of the slippery slope. So the motivation was, I think, well-founded. There was things about the CHIPS Act that I thought were useful, but soon after its passage, you saw the set of Commerce Department policies associated with the recipients of the funding from the CHIPS Act in terms of daycare and diversity and all these other things, where you're trying to impose a set of the Biden administration is trying to impose a set of political objectives on top of a set of technological leadership objectives. So I'm not arguing for that. What I'm arguing for is a set of incentives, primarily, that draw private sector capital to the right industries, not even the right companies. I think anytime you get government in the process of picking companies, you're almost doomed to failure. But if you can, through tax incentives, or you can through co-investment, which is what I argue for a fund in the book that would co-invest with the private sector to draw capital to the technologies that are going to have the biggest impact for America's security, for America's economic vitality. That is where I think the biggest bang for the buck can be. And so I lay out a plan for doing that. I also lay out a set of principles that should guide this to avoid the slippery slope. And then I make the case that, listen, the one thing government can and should do, even small government conservatives like me, I think can agree that we need to be the driver of basic R&D. and the government needs to play a much more aggressive role there. The R&D spending today is about half of what it was as a percentage of GDP in 1950. And that's where we can continue to lead the world. And that's an area where I would invest. So that's the outline of the technology leadership plan. And I make the case here. I have a part of the chapter that says, what would Milton Friedman say? And I think Milton Friedman, if he were here, probably wouldn't like my argument. But then I said, well, but Milton, what would you say to the fact that we're 37 of the 44 technologies in the study that I cited, we're losing our leadership. And the reason we're losing our leadership is because it's not a fair playing field. There's a whole set of reasons, capital requirements, and as I said, intellectual property theft, and a number of other reasons that we're losing our leadership. We've got to confront that. The stakes are too high for all the reasons I've said before. And so that's the basis for a technology innovation strategy to carry us forward.
Excellent. I have another here from Eric Euland, who asks about your experience on the campaign trail and what was the reaction of Pennsylvania voters to these types of ideas. And I'll add kind of how did your interactions with Pennsylvania voters in the 2022 Republican primary shape the ultimate shape the ideas that went into kind of the final form of this book and this argument.
Yeah, well, listen, it was an incredible experience, mostly great. We absolutely loved it, and I felt like it was a privilege. I felt like it was a privilege to be at the position in my life where I could run, and it was a huge learning because we all sit here and debate policies and write articles and books and think about things, but when you start to get many, like thousands of interactions with people who are affected by the policies, I did 30,000 miles in my pickup truck in 5 months. Every diner, VFW, Elks Lodge. I mean, everything I could find needed 20 people, 200 people. And you just start hearing the same things over and over. And you start to see the problems. You start to see how policies and ideas resonate. You start to see how certain things don't resonate. You start to see some of the risks. A good example is to talk on the campaign trail when there's anger. There's this anger, and legitimately so, in my opinion, about illegal immigration, and then to be able to talk in parallel about skilled immigration. I mean, that's tough to do because the nuance there and what it requires, that's a tough thing. And on a campaign trail, you have 30 seconds. And you're talking about yourself. You're not really having a chance to elaborate on ideas. So this book was certainly informed by that. I had written probably with my colleague, James Cunningham, probably 60 or 70% of it before the campaign. He continued to work on it while I was campaigning and helped me on the campaign a lot. And then we finished it together. At the end, it was certainly informed. There's lots of stories in it that sort of take somewhat dry policy prescriptions and try to bring them to life. And, in the end, I think part of my optimism is just that engagement with thousands of people where they're on their, they're down on their luck in many cases, they're upset, they've lost faith in leadership at the moment, but they're pretty resilient and they have confidence in America, even if they don't have confidence at the moment in the people that are leading us. That's not a partisan statement on any side. They lack confidence in our leaders in general. And this was a great experience to see that up close and personal.
I have an anonymous question here, which I think might be interesting. What's the most important criteria for you when measuring the progress of a nation and the progress of the United States?
Well, it's a really good question. I think it's the promise. The promise of the whole thing is predicated on a basic proposition, which is you get everything that America has to offer, and if you work hard and play by the rules, you're going to have a chance to have a better life than than your parents, or if you're a parent, your kids are going to have a better life than you. So that requires the American dream requires dynamism. It requires the capacity to innovate and grow and offer opportunity. People come here because they want opportunity. So if you start to have an economy where if you're born in the fourth quartile, there's a 90% chance you're going to stay in the fourth quartile. It's not quite that yet, but it's on the way there. That's not consistent with America's promise. If we have an economy that's not growing, if we have an economy that's not open for all, where someone who's a minority or someone who's a blue collar worker doesn't have that chance to live that American dream, I think that chips away at one of the basic promises. So I think I think that is one measure. I think a second measure, I'll give two if it's okay.
Please.
But it's worry, and so I think that one's at risk. That one's certainly at risk, and people don't. All the polling shows that, and all the data shows that. The second one is if people believe that America is, exceptional and worth keeping that way, and the recent Wall Street Journal poll, I think it was at University of Chicago, about patriotism, something like 37% of Americans, are patriotic, believe patriotism is important. Like I'm deeply worried about that, deeply worried, because there's this great line from William F. Buckley that I cite in the book, which citizenship is a blend of privilege to be part of America, to be part of this incredible experiment. It's also responsibility. And so if people don't feel a responsibility to keep it that way, if people don't believe it's exceptional and feel a responsibility to keep it exceptional, and I worry our schools are not teaching our kids that America's exceptional, then you got two problems that are potentially fatal. One problem is the promise is deteriorating, and the second is people don't even believe the promise is worth pursuing, and that's a big deal. And when I said in the beginning, I'm worried about the spiritual decline. There's a whole bunch of stuff I talk about. I talk about wokeness and the progressive ideology and stuff like that. I really believe those are problems, but at its core, if you don't believe America's special and worth preserving, and we don't all wake up thinking we have an obligation to do our part, then that's the beginning of the end. And those are the two things I'd highlight as measures of, our risk, our exposure, but also things I would keep an eye on to see if we're making progress.
Excellent. I have another from John Lord, who says, he believes, market demands are often in conflict with the political dynamism and the political pressures that are required, or decision-making that's required to affect change in our relationship with China. And he's curious if you agree, and what needs to be done to navigate that tension and that relationship.
Well, if I'm understanding the question, I think it's a little bit to the point I was trying to make before, which is the decisions we need to make on China will have economic cost. In other words, there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off at the economy level. We will get more security, more independence, and there will be an economic penalty, at least in the near term, that'll result from that. And then, of course, that carries down to individual companies. So if companies that are exposed in China, particularly in companies that are in strategic industries, by enforcing the fact that we can't be reliant on Chinese supply chains, where companies aren't allowed to invest in certain sensitive sectors in China, that will be in conflict in certain places, in certain companies, in certain sectors with shareholder value or economic growth or whatever. And I say, yes, it is. That's the trade-off. So yes, we will pay that penalty to create independence, reduce our dependency on China, and enhance our security. Now, that can't be done with a butcher knife. That has to be done deftly. That has to be done with care. That can't be done. That's why we need to have tangible policies and not just a lot of hand waving about what we're going to do. But it needs to be done, and it needs to be done with precision, but with I think determination. And it will be politically difficult, in part because it will cost something.
Um, Going kind of in the other direction from, government to business, but then in the other direction from business to government, the question, back in the 1960s, the Pentagon drove technological innovation. This gets to your point about R&D funding. Today, it's business that drives innovation with much greater speed and lower costs. What do you think the private sector can teach the Pentagon and the rest of the federal government about innovation and speed? And what does the government need to do to harness private sector experience?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I try to talk a bit about that in the book, but I think there's a lot more to be said on that beyond what I've said. But certainly, one of the challenges is that our innovation ecosystem for our Pentagon is a closed system for a large. It's a closed system. We have, five primes or whatever it is that account for the large majority of the business. The procurement process is labyrinth. You as a small company, you have to be able to invest so much time and energy and take on so much risk to be able to do business with the government that many aren't willing to bet the company on that opportunity set. We have some potential examples of companies that are beginning to break into that, but it's a very, very closed system. So that's problem one. And so we need procurement reform. We need a much greater set of policies that are encouraging and testing and allowing smaller cutting edge providers to get into the Pentagon ecosystem. The Defense Innovation Unit or Incutel, those models at much, much grander scale, I think are going to be necessary. And I think there's a risk, which I try to talk about in the book, we have a real cultural problem, I believe, on innovation. In other words, I think our leadership in our Pentagon and the culture of the Pentagon is very risk averse. And so anybody that's worked in technology, I used to run a software company, knows that failure and creating an ecosystem where you're testing and failing. I don't mean testing and failing on the battlefield, but I mean testing and failing all sorts of alternative technologies and ways to do things is necessary for driving forward on the path to innovation. And so I think we've got a structural problem in terms of the way the procurement process works. And I think we got a cultural problem within our Pentagon, both civilian and military leaders, that isn't agile. It isn't focused on failure to learn and grow and evolve. And it worries me. And it starts at the top, frankly, within our Pentagon, and it works our way down. If you were to sort of imagine what kind of leadership is going to be required to totally take our military in the next direction over the next few decades, I don't think you'd have the current leadership we have. So I think that's a real problem. And then, you have the final problem, which is the big tech firms, at least thus far, with a couple exceptions, haven't embraced the notion of working closely with the Pentagon. And I think that should be reversed. I think they should be held accountable for that. I think that should come with a cost. I'm not quite sure how to do that because, I'm sympathetic to the small government not exercising overreach, but I find that to be unacceptable in terms of the disposition of our big tech firms and their role in supporting America's strength in the world.
All right. Well, as we come up close to the hour here, I think I'm going to choose one from the audience pile that hits on a couple of the threads we've gone through in the Q&A. Just as a wrap up, how do you think policymakers, and especially outside organizations, think tanks, organizations like Vandenberg, better work to communicate with the public, American companies, private organizations, to fully understand the threat from China, the steps we need, especially the painful steps we need to compete against China and to renew ourselves and prevail?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure. I'd say that creating forums where all sides can, be adequately heard, is pretty valuable. And I got like lots of these little microcosms from the campaign trail, but I remember being in York, Pennsylvania, which is kind of a big manufacturing area, and doing a bunch of visits. And one day I did a visit to a machine shop, a manufacturer, and the guy who ran it, I walked the floor, and he told me, "Hey, listen, this China, you got to take on China, and you got to have a tough line on China, and we got screwed by China, and it killed our manufacturing base, blah blah blah." Boy, that's interesting. This guy, so I don't know, 100-person firm or something, he really feels the China challenge. Then I went a little later in the day to another machine shop, and this machine shop made frames that went on the back of Harley Davidson motorcycles, which are manufactured in York. And those Harley Davidsons get exported to China. And the guy said, "Hey, whatever you do, don't be an idiot on China. China is a big opportunity for us. Most of these racks were manufactured for the back of the." And so in one day, both equally earnest, both affected, their ability to survive as a business. Both had, real world consequences for the workers they had. Both had, legitimate. And I thought to myself, if you were going to be the senator from Pennsylvania, and you were thinking about China, if you could take those two guys with you, and be walking down the hallways, and every time you had an issue come to you, you lean one way and then lean the other way, because I think you need to hear, the different sides of the argument. So, for example, I've tried to, I've sort of taken the wood to big tech here in this conversation, because I believe that it's a real failure. I'd like to hear the other side of that. I'd like to understand what the heck those guys are thinking, that here they are in America, and they're playing such a terribly inadequate role in my mind in helping secure our leadership in the world from a technological perspective. And I like to hear those trade-offs. So that may be a hand-wavy, simplistic answer, but I think really getting into the direction of the policy, and then getting into a nuanced discussion around the implications of different things will go a long way. When you talk about strategic decoupling, for example, where's the line? I have my own line. I try to lay it out in the book, but how far does that go down from strategic decoupling to just decoupling? There's a lot of thought that needs to go into that. And I think getting the right sophistication around the table and different views is going to be necessary to draw those lines, even if everybody agrees on the big thrust of strategic decoupling.
Excellent. Well, I know you're on a tight schedule, and I know a lot of our audience has 4 o'clock meetings they have to get to. So David, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to shout out the book and tell people where they can follow you on social media and find you online?
Yes, it's Superpower in Peril, a battle plan to renew America. And it's available at davemccormickbook.com. And thanks for having the opportunity to talk about it.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us. Thank you all for joining us, and stay tuned for more book talks and events and publications from the Vandenberg Coalition.